in the Montana Territory of 1884, where the wind could strip a man's resolve as quick as it could scour a canyon wall. Colt Rawlins had settled into a life stripped of surprise. A widowed rancher with more years behind him than ahead, he worked the Rawlins spread north of Dry Creek Bend, in the same way he breathed steady, solitary, and without expectation of change. But on one blistering summer afternoon, fate shifted in the smallest, quietest of ways. Two children, dust-streaked, hollow-eyed, and clutching the last scraps of their world, sat huddled in the shadow of the post office awning. They weren't calling for help. They weren't even looking up. Yet in them, Colt saw something that reached past the fences he'd built around his life and touched the place where grief still lived. What began as a simple offer of food and shelter would grow into a bond that defied bloodlines, silenced gossip, and challenged every belief Colt had about second chances. Through bitter winters, small-town cruelty, and the slow mending of trust, a man who thought his heart was finished discovered it could still make room. And in giving two abandoned souls a home, he would leave behind a legacy not measured in land or cattle, but in the enduring truth that family is something you choose. The Montana sun hung low and unforgiving over the dirt-packed main road of Dry Creek Bend, casting heat waves that shimmered like ghosts across the frontier town's empty noon streets. Dust clung to every wooden boardwalk, every tired storefront, and every boot heel that dared cross the thoroughfare. Most folks had retreated indoors away from the blistering air and the weight of a summer afternoon in 1884. But Colt Rawlins didn't mind the heat. A man like him, aged 54 and worn smooth by prairie wind and cattle storms, had learned long ago that discomfort was just part of living. He rode into town on a speckled sorrel mare saddle, creaking with each step, the brim of his felt hat shadowing a face carved by time and silence. Colt wasn't known for small talk. In fact, most folks at Dry Creek Bend knew him only by reputation, a widowed rancher who ran the Rawlins spread north of the canyon, a man who kept to himself and didn't much believe in second chances. That notion was about to change. He spotted them before he reached the mercantile. Two small figures huddled together in the shadow of the post office awning, as still as stones in riverbed silt. A boy and a girl, maybe 8 or 9, with dust-coated clothes and the wary eyes of animals that had seen too much, too young. They didn't look up when he rode by. Just sat there clutching faded bundles that probably held everything they owned in the world. Colt dismounted outside the general store where Elias Boone, the shopkeeper, stood watching with concern drawn deep across his brow. "Found 'em just after sunup," Elias said quietly, nodding toward the children. "Been sitting there since first light. No folks in sight. No names either, least not that they'd give to me." Colt turned, boots crunching in the gravel as he walked toward the children. He crouched slowly, his knees stiff with age, and studied them from under the brim of his hat. The boy, bony and sunburned, shifted forward instinctively, placing his body between Colt and the girl. She peeked out behind him with wide, gray-blue eyes and fingers tangled in the frayed hem of her skirt. "What's your name?" son Colt asked, voice low and even. The boy didn't speak at first. His jaw was tight, the kind of tight Colt had seen in Mustangs before a break, pride stitched into fear. Then, just above a whisper, "I'm Will. She's Maggie." Colt nodded. "You got folks nearby?" Will shook his head. "Mama passed in the spring. Pa, a tree fell on him last month. We buried him out by the willows near the creek." The words were simple, but they struck like a hammer. Colt stood slowly, heart thudding behind his ribs. He'd buried his own wife and son years ago, and never thought he'd feel that particular ache again. And yet here it was, sharp as barbed wire, and just as unexpected. "Where've you been sleep in the old smokehouse on our land until the sheriff told us we had no right to it no more? Said it's bank property now." Maggie's voice was soft but clear. Said we couldn't stay. Said we didn't belong. Colt exhaled the breath long and heavy. Belonging. It was a word he hadn't thought much about in years. But as he looked down at those two frightened kids, something in him stirred. Not pity, he didn't believe in that. What he felt was a flicker of purpose, of possibility, of family. He looked back at Elias. They eat anything yet? Not much. Colt nodded, jaw set. Then I reckon we start there. And just like that, a man who had closed every door to his heart opened one wide enough for two children to walk through and maybe, just maybe, find home again. The ride back to the Rawlins ranch took the better part of 2 hours, with Colt guiding his mare slowly alongside the old wagon he'd borrowed from the mercantile. Will and Maggie sat in the back, nestled between hay bales and a folded wool blanket, too polite or too proud to sleep, but too exhausted to talk. The girl leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, eyelids fluttering with the kind of drowsy trust that comes only after danger has passed, even if only for a moment. Colt didn't talk much during the ride. He wasn't sure what to say. Words had never come easy to him, especially around children. His late wife, Rose, had been the one who filled silences with song or stories, who'd known just how to coax a laugh from their boy Caleb. But Rose had been gone over a decade now, and Caleb, nearly as long. Colt had spent most of the years since then working the land in solitude, letting the silence settle deep in his bones like silt at the bottom of a creek bed. As the wagon crested the last rise before home, the Rawlins spread came into view, a patch of green in a landscape of stubborn browns and golden grass. Fenced pastures stretched wide beneath the sky, cattle grazing lazily. The barn roof weathered but holding smoke curling gently from the chimney of the main house. Maggie stirred as the wheels jostled over the rocky path. "Is that your place, mister?" she asked softly. Colt glanced back over his shoulder. "It is. But starting now, you can just call me Colt." She nodded once, still uncertain, but a little less afraid. Will, sitting upright and alert, despite the bone-deep fatigue clinging to his limbs, studied the layout with a quiet wariness, the kind of look that said he was already trying to figure out where the threats might be, where the exits were. Colt saw it. He understood it. He parked the wagon near the back porch and helped them down gently, but without fuss. Will refused a hand, but staggered slightly when he hit the dirt. Maggie took Colt's fingers briefly as she stepped down her hand, cold her grip feather light, but it was a start. Inside the ranch house, the air smelled of dry pine wood and long memory. It was tidy, but still the kind of tidy that came from absence more than habit. Dust only collects where nothing stirs, and the Rawlins house hadn't stirred in a long while. The large kitchen felt cavernous as the children looked around, unsure where to stand. "You're welcome here," Colt said simply, setting a pot of water to boil. "You don't owe me anything but honesty and effort." Will blinked as if that kind of deal was foreign to him. Maggie just nodded and sat gingerly on the bench beside the old iron stove. Colt ladled out some leftover beef stew he'd canned last fall and watched the children eat cautiously at first, then with the hunger of kids who'd been skipping meals far too long. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Colt led them upstairs and showed them the guest room at the end of the hall. 2 cots had been set up. He'd hurried the task earlier that day, instincts kicking in before his mind could even catch up to his decision. The walls were bare, but the sheets were clean, and the window opened toward the east pasture where the morning light would be softest. "You'll share the room," Colt said, "unless or until we figure out something else." Maggie nodded. Will said nothing, but he walked the perimeter of the room, slowly inspecting it like a scout would a trail camp. Only when he pulled a small cloth-wrapped bundle from his satchel containing what looked like a comb, 2 socks and a photograph with the corners worn white, did his shoulders lower just a bit. That night the ranch house wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. There were the soft clinks of dishes being washed, the whisper of floorboards under tentative feet, the murmur of Colt's voice as he showed Will how to stoke the fire before bed, for days after they moved like guests. The children never took seconds at supper. They asked permission for everything, even to go outside. Maggie folded her napkin after each meal like she was in church. Will offered to help with every task, from hauling wood to brushing the horses. He was strong for his age, but there was a desperation behind it, a silent urgency that said, "Please let me stay. Let me be worth keeping." Colt didn't push. He just gave them tasks and room. A routine formed. Mornings began with biscuits and eggs and quiet talk over coffee and milk. Will learned to check fence lines. Maggie helped Isabel Ortega, who visited twice a week, to help Colt with garden harvests and canning. Little by little, their presence began to alter the rhythm of the house. It was small things. A second fork laid out automatically at breakfast. A laugh that slipped from Maggie's throat when a barn cat chased its own tail. Will tapping his boot in time with Colt's porch rocking chair. They didn't trust yet, not completely, but the walls were shifting. The weight of worry began to lift. One morning, a week after their arrival, Maggie came into the kitchen wearing a clean gingham apron and humming. Not loud, just a whisper of a tune, but it stopped Colt in his tracks. "You know that song?" he asked. Maggie paused, startled, then nodded. "Mama used to sing it when she made blackberry jam." Colt nodded, his voice low. "My Rose sang that one too." And just like that, a new thread stitched quietly between them. That evening, Colt found Will asleep on the front steps, boots still on, hat over his face like he'd meant to stay alert and failed. Instead of waking him, Colt fetched a quilt and covered the boy gently. He stood there for a long while, staring out at the horizon as the stars blinked to life. In the quiet hum of night, Colt realized that the house no longer felt like it echoed. It breathed again. By late August, the rhythms of the Rawlins ranch had settled into something that felt almost natural. Will and Maggie had begun to move through the place like it was theirs, not out of entitlement, but with the hesitant grace of children who dared to believe they might finally belong. Maggie whistled softly as she collected eggs each morning, and Will had taken to brushing down the horses before Colt even asked. They were still cautious, but the sharp edges had softened. But not everyone outside the ranch shared Colt's quiet conviction that the children deserved this new start. One Saturday, Colt hitched the wagon to fetch supplies from town, leaving Will and Maggie behind to finish chores. Tomas Ortega, the ranch's head wrangler, had agreed to keep an eye on things while tending the stock. The morning passed peacefully. Maggie helped Isabel prepare tomatoes for canning, and Will spent the better part of the day near the round pen, watching Thomas work a green gelding named Dusty. Thomas noticed the boy's silent observation and gave a nod. "You want to try holding the lead line?" Mijo Will's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir." It was a small step, just learning to feel the horse's movements, match its pace, and guide gently, but Thomas smiled at the boy's natural timing and instinctive steadiness. "You've got ranch hands twice your age who don't listen this well," he said with a wink. That praise clung to Will like sunlight, but the brightness didn't last. That afternoon, while Thomas was tending to a sick calf in the north pasture, two boys rode up the ranch lane uninvited. Brody and Jesse Riggs, sons of a nearby cattleman with a sour opinion of anyone who didn't belong to his bloodline. Brody, the older one, dismounted first, his boots kicking up dust as he approached the corral with a crooked grin. Will was just inside the fence, coaxing Dusty through a walking circle. "Well, look at that," Brody sneered. "Little orphan boy playing cowboy." Will stiffened, but didn't turn around. "I'm working with Mr. Ortega's horse. He gave me permission." Jesse leaned against the rail. "Pa says Rawlins just took you in because he's gone soft. Says you don't belong on this land, and once he gets tired of babysitting, you'll be carted off like stray dogs." Will's jaw clenched and Dusty spooked slightly at the shift in energy. The Riggs boys kept pressing. Heard your real daddy got squashed like a bug under a tree. Maybe it runs in the family, too dumb to stay alive. That did it. Will dropped the lead rope and stormed toward the fence, fists balled tight at his sides. You don't talk about my pa, or Mr. Rawlins. You don't know anything. Jesse smirked. Oh, but we know Rawlins ain't your family. He just feels sorry for you. Everyone in town says so. A sharp voice cut across the yard like a whip. That's enough. Thomas had returned quicker than expected and stood tall beside the barn, eyes narrowed, voice low and dangerous. The Riggs boys froze. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make most men reconsider their choices. You've got 3 seconds to get back on your horses and off this property, Thomas said. Next time I won't ask twice. Brody sneered, but he backed down. Whatever. Ain't our fault you got stray dogs running your place. They mounted up and rode off, spitting dust behind them. Will stood rooted, cheeks red with anger and shame. Maggie had come out during the commotion and stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself. Tomas walked to the boy, his voice soft now. You all right? Will nodded stiffly. They're wrong. I know, Tomas said, but you don't have to prove them wrong every time they open their mouths. You just have to keep being you. That's more than enough. When Colt returned and heard what happened, he didn't respond right away. He sat on the porch with Will and Maggie after supper. The sky streaked with orange as the sun dipped low behind the hills. Will stared out across the field, his voice quiet. They said you only took us in 'cause you felt bad, that you're gonna send us away when we mess up. Colt took a breath, slow and heavy. You think I'd put a roof over your head, feed you, teach you about horses, and give you chores just so I could toss you out the first time something got hard? Will didn't answer. Colt turned toward both children, voice steady as bedrock. I took you in because I saw something in you. Not pity. Fire. Honor. The kind of backbone this land was built on. You're not charity. You're family. And there ain't a thing in this world that's going to change that. Maggie's lower lip trembled. Even if we mess up, Colt looked her square in the eye. Especially then. The porch fell silent except for the creak of wood and the whistle of wind through the dry grass. Come here, Colt said gruffly. Maggie hesitated, then climbed into his lap, curling against his chest like she'd done it 100 times. Will leaned against the railing nearby, still tense but no longer brittle. Colt rested his weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. Let people talk, he said, but you two, you stay the course. I've seen more strength in you both than in half the grown men I've ever hired. That night, as stars peppered the sky and coyotes called from the ridge, Maggie whispered, He called us family. Will curled in his cot, eyes wide open in the dark, replied, He meant it. The words didn't fix everything, but they were roots, deep, solid, and finally beginning to take hold. By the time autumn rolled into Dry Creek Bend with its crimson leaves and first frost warnings, the Rawlins ranch had changed in ways no ledger or feed chart could capture. The cattle still needed driving, the fences mending, and the woodpiles stacking, but something softer had rooted itself between the chores, a quiet sense of continuity. A household once filled with ghosts had become a place where laughter routine, and something dangerously close to joy now lived. Maggie had taken to calling the kitchen her territory, and Isabel Ortega, who taught her the secrets of proper biscuit dough and the patience required for pickling beans, had only good things to say. She listens, she remembers, and she cares about what the food feels like, not just how it tastes. Isabel told Colt one evening as they shelled peas on the back porch. Will, meanwhile, had grown into the rhythm of ranch life, like he'd been born in a saddle. He was up before dawn, hauling water, grooming horses, asking questions that belied a mind far older than his years. Tomas Ortega kept a close eye on him, And one day, after a long training session with a skittish bay colt, he'd pulled Colt aside. "That boy's not just working hard, Patron. He's listening to the horses, feeling them. I've seen grown men break bones before they break their pride. But Will, he leads with respect. That's rare." Colt didn't respond immediately. He was watching from the edge of the barn as Will helped Maggie up onto the old fence rail so she could reach the apple tree branches. The boy had his arms crossed, eyes scanning the ground beneath her, ready to catch if needed, but saying nothing. That protective silence told Colt more about the boy's character than any glowing report ever could. Later that week, as frost began to touch the tips of the pasture grass and the wind took on a sharper edge, Colt brought in a stack of new blankets and a wool-lined coat he'd ordered from town. He laid them out on the kitchen table after supper. "For you," he said, simply pushing them toward Will and Maggie. "Cold's coming fast this year." Maggie reached out to trace the stitching on her blanket, green plaid soft to the touch. Will hesitated. "These new?" he asked, skeptical. Colt nodded. "Never been worn." Will looked down. "You didn't have to buy new. We're fine with what we have." Colt leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Don't argue about being cared for, son. You wouldn't tell me not to shoe a horse just because he's made it this long barefoot." The term son hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. Will blinked, swallowed hard, and said nothing. But Maggie smiled, tucking her new blanket to her chest, like it meant something more than just warmth. It meant place. It meant permanence. Around that time, Colt found himself spending more hours in the house than he used to. He still worked. The land still met with buyers and ranch hands, but the center of his day was no longer the range. It was the table, the porch, the sound of Maggie's humming, and Will's dry humor creeping in during supper. The boy had a sharp tongue when he chose to use it, and he was starting to choose it more often. Then came the night Colt woke, coughing. It wasn't the first time he'd had these fits off and on since the previous winter, but this one lingered longer, deeper. When he finally caught his breath and saw the fear in Maggie's face, he waved her off. Just dust in the chimney, he lied. But by the next week, Dr. Elias Boone had been out to the ranch and left with a pinched expression. Colt didn't say anything to the children, not yet. Instead, he did what men like him had always done. He got his affairs in order. He met with Judge McLean in town, laid out the adoption papers that had sat unfinished for too long. "They need to be mine," Colt said simply. "In every way that matters." The judge had nodded. "We'll file it all legal before the snow falls." On the ride home, Colt kept one hand resting on the folded documents tucked into his satchel. It felt like something sacred. He didn't tell Will and Maggie until a few days later. After supper, he called them into the sitting room where a fire popped gently in the stone hearth. "I went into town," he began. Maggie looked up from her knitting. "You didn't tell us you were leaving." "I didn't want to fuss," Colt said, lips twitching with a near smile. "Had business to settle. Important kind." He placed the signed documents on the table. "What's that?" Will asked, already sensing it mattered. "Papers making what we already are official. I'm your legal guardian now, full and proper. No court or sheriff can tell you different." For a moment, neither child moved. Then Maggie dropped her knitting and ran to him, arms tight around his waist. Will stayed rooted, staring at the paper like it might vanish if he blinked. "You sure?" Will asked. Not as a challenge, but as a plea for confirmation. Colt stood and walked over, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "More sure than anything I've done in 10 years. Will nodded, eyes glossy but defiant. "Then I'll do my part. I'll make sure the ranch stays running. Maggie'll cook, and I'll help Thomas with the yearlings." Colt knelt to look him in the eye. "You don't have to earn your keep, son. You're not here to pay rent in sweat and silence. You're here because I choose you, Both of you." Maggie whispered, "Papa." The word was new, tentative. But Colt let it wash over him like rain on dry earth. That night the ranch house glowed with more than lamplight. It glowed with purpose, with belonging that no deed of land could measure, and with the unmistakable feeling of something finally being made whole. The winter of 1887 came early and without mercy. Snow piled high along the fence lines of the Rawlins Ranch before Halloween even passed. By Thanksgiving, the ground was locked in white silence, and the creek near the barn had frozen so hard you could walk across it without a whisper of give. But it wasn't the cold that tightened its grip on the ranch. It was something heavier, something Colt Rawlins had carried quietly for months. He'd tried to keep up with the routines. He still rose early, still checked the barns, still ate breakfast at the same worn table with Will and Maggie each morning. But the cough that had begun as a dry tickle in the spring was now a ragged bark that stole the air from his chest and left his palms dotted with blood. He'd hoped the medicine Dr. Boone brought would help. It didn't. By December, Colt could no longer saddle his own horse. Will tried to pretend nothing was wrong. He took over the morning rounds, kept the herd in line, patched the chicken coop when a coyote broke through. Maggie cooked warm meals, sang softly in the evenings, and sat by Colt's side, with her small hand wrapped in his weathered one. They didn't speak of dying, not out loud, but the truth moved through the house like smoke, visible, undeniable, and choking. One quiet evening, as snow whispered against the windows, Colt called them both into his bedroom. He was thinner now, face drawn and sunken, but his voice still held the iron Will had always respected. "I want to talk before I can't." Will nodded once Maggie clutched her doll in silence. "This ranch, it's yours now. I signed everything legal, all filed in town. Deeds, accounts, livestock tallies. You're set up right." Maggie's eyes brimmed. "Don't say goodbye yet." "I ain't," Colt said gently. "I'm just making sure the pieces are in place." He paused, then added with a quiet smile, "You two gave me 3 more years of living. Real living, not just surviving." Will swallowed hard. "We'll take care of everything." Colt reached out, handshaking, and placed it over Will's. "That's not what matters most. It's not about land or head count. It's about keeping what we built, a home, not just a ranch." He turned to Maggie. "And you, girl, don't ever let anyone tell you you're not strong. You've got your mother's fire in you. Even if she's gone, that fire's still burning." The next morning, the sun rose over a ranch forever changed. Colt passed in his sleep before the kettle had boiled. Peaceful, the doctor said. Quick. Will didn't cry at first. He just stood there, jaw tight, staring at the bed like Colt might still sit up and ask for coffee. Maggie sobbed quietly beside him, clinging to the hand that had once hoisted her onto the hay wagon. "Doctor." Boone closed the man's eyes and packed his bag slowly, like he didn't want to leave just yet. He held on longer than most would, he murmured. "But love can give a man extra time. I believe that." Word spread fast through Dry Creek Bend. Folks came in droves for the funeral. Some wore black. Others wore denim and dust, the way Colt would have liked it. Tomas stood near the front, hat pressed to his chest. Isabel held Maggie's hand through the service. Even Judge McLean showed up, nodding solemnly as Will and Maggie stepped forward to speak. Will's voice didn't shake. "He wasn't our blood," he said, staring out at the gathered crowd. "But he chose us. He taught us that family isn't just who you're born to. It's who shows up again and again, even when they don't have to." Maggie added, "He didn't save us to be heroes in his story. He saved us so we could write our own." They buried Colt near the east pasture under the same tree where he used to watch the sun go down with a tin cup in hand. The inscription on the stone was simple: Colt Rawlins, father rancher, believer in second chances. The days that followed weren't easy. Winter bore down hard with snowdrifts like walls and coyotes howling from the ridge at night. But Will took the lead, guiding the ranch crew, managing accounts with the same stoic focus Colt had once taught him. He oversaw feed delivery, penned orders for spring calves, and kept the fences standing through the freeze. Maggie managed the household, grew into her role as the woman of the ranch, not through age, but through grace and grit. She handled letters, planned meals for the crew, kept a ledger of supplies, and kept the fire lit each night, both literal and emotional. And they didn't do it alone. Thomas and Isabel, the ranch hands, the community, everyone who had seen the way Colt changed after taking in those children, stepped up, not out of pity, but out of respect. By spring, the snow melted into mud, then gave way to green. One April morning, Will and Maggie rode out to the grave, bouquets of wildflowers in their hands. They sat beside the stone for a long while, speaking softly. "I wrote something," Maggie said, unfolding a piece of parchment. She read aloud about how the cattle herd had doubled, how the orchard was bearing again, how the ranch had turned a profit even through winter. But mostly, she wrote about love, about safety, about becoming whole. Will laid a hand on the stone. "We're not just keeping the ranch alive, Papa. We're making it stronger, like you showed us." That night they returned home to find a bundle of kittens born in the barn. Maggie cradled one in her apron, smiling for the first time in weeks. Will grinned. "Name one after him." She nodded. "Oldest and loudest." They laughed. Not because everything was okay, but because some things were still good. And that was enough. Years passed like windswept seasons across the Montana prairie. But the memory of Colt Rawlins never faded. Not in the fields he once plowed. Not in the house he rebuilt, with silence and patience. And certainly not in the hearts of Will and Maggie, who had once arrived at his doorstep with nothing but a threadbare bundle and a shared desperation to stay together. Now, in their late teens, the foster siblings no longer looked like the wary, weather-worn children Colt had first found beneath the awning of Dry Creek Bend's post office. Will had grown tall and steady, a man of few words, but fierce loyalty, much like Colt himself. He oversaw the ranch's operations with a keen mind and a strong back, known among neighboring ranchers for his fairness in deals and his quiet but commanding leadership. Maggie, graceful and grounded, had become the heart of the home. Her voice carried through the kitchen at dawn, humming old prairie songs as she prepared meals for the crew and ran the household ledger with meticulous care. She could still mend a shirt faster than most women could hem a dress, and her preserves were the talk of the valley. But what truly defined the Lazy Bee Ranch, what gave it a pulse beyond profit, was not its cattle count or its acreage. It was the unmistakable presence of love, built through choice, not blood. Every visitor who crossed the threshold sensed it. There were photo frames on the mantel now, one of Colt holding a newborn foal, one of the twins at their first harvest, another of Thomas and Isabel Ortega, whom Will and Maggie still called Tio and Tia. The kitchen table, once a wide expanse of unused wood, now bore the scuffs and scratches of shared meals, late-night plans, and laughter that echoed through the rafters. On the 5th anniversary of Colt's passing, the siblings returned to the tree under which he'd been laid to rest, a gnarled cottonwood that now shaded a bed of wildflowers Maggie had carefully tended each spring. Will set down a bottle of Colt's favorite rye whiskey. Maggie laid a letter folded neatly under a stone. They sat in silence a while until Maggie whispered, "He gave us more than a home. He gave us a name, a place to belong." Will nodded slowly. "He didn't rescue us. He believed in us. That's what saved us." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above them like an old man clearing his throat. The ranch awaited their return, but neither was in a hurry. In that still moment, surrounded by prairie light and wild sage, they felt Colt's legacy not as a burden, but as a gift. And long after they had children of their own, Will and Maggie would tell the story of the man who had changed their lives, not with grand gestures, but with quiet faith. They would tell how a lonely rancher opened his home and found his heart again, how two scared kids grew into capable stewards of land and love, and how family, true family, is something you choose every single day. Colt Rawlins had once believed he was too broken to begin again, but in loving two forgotten children, he planted a legacy far stronger than any fence post or barn beam, a legacy of belonging forged not by blood, but by the kind of love that stays through storms, through silence, and even after goodbye. If this story stirred something in your heart, don't ride off just yet. Subscribe to Whispers of the West for more tales of redemption, resilience, and the kind of love that heals across open plains. Hit that bell so you never miss a journey worth taking, because out here, every whisper carries a story waiting to be heard.